But it is it's a great way to start talking about the ways in which we get our libations. So cheers to all of you. Thank you for coming to another PAFA Pours. So
cheers.
Cheers. Cheers. It's so nice to see so many of you here with us tonight. I recognize a lot of you, but I see a lot of new names as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Abby King. I'm the Assistant Director of Adult Programs here at PAFA. And before I turn it over to our lovely speakers, I want to just quickly do some Zoom housekeeping real quick. So to start with, I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. So I just went ahead and muted everyone because Zoom likes to assume that it knows who the speaker is. So a little bit like our please silence your cell phones in the days when we would meet physically, I'm going to ask that unless you're actively speaking, that you keep your Zoom camera on mute. We do want to hear from you, and I'll talk about the ways in which we want to in just a second. But to start, besides that, I want to mention that Zoom basically has two views in which you can see us tonight. So if I'm the big giant screen at the bottom of, big giant head at the bottom of your screen, you're in speaker view. That's what I personally would recommend that you keep this on, at least for the beginning, so you can see Anna and Robert large and talking, going back and forth. If you'd like to change it to see all 55 of our participants so far, if you go to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see where there's 9 blocks or squares stacked on one another. If you click on that, you can see everybody. And so this, once we get into the discussion mode, might be helpful if you want to see people's reactions, see everyone here this evening. That's an option. The nice thing about Zoom is that you can actually see whatever you choose for your screen doesn't impact anyone else. So pick whatever feels the best for you. Other things on just visibility, like I mentioned, I just muted everybody. If and when we call on you or you're sharing later, if you'd like to unmute yourself, the way you do that is at the bottom of your screen is a little microphone button. And then right next to that is a little, what looks like a camera, a square and a triangle together. If you can't see yourself and you'd like to be on video for this event, you just click on that and we'll be able to see you. I mention that because we are recording tonight's event. We like to share these with the people who can't be with us this evening. And so if you'd like to not be on the recording, one way is just to silence your camera. You can still be here, you can hang out, drink some wine in your PJs, and no one will be able to see you. That also said, unless you're actively talking, like raising your hand and sharing, we won't really be able to see you on the video recording as well. That brings me to sharing. So a few of you have already started to we'll use our chat. I recommend if you have questions or comments, links to things, if you'd like to drop them in, feel free to do it here. I'm going to go ahead and drop my email in to here as well. So if anyone has questions, technical difficulties, you can email me, or about future programs, please check out our website. We have a wonderful slate of programming on there as well. And lastly, so we are going to open this up for discussion. We want to hear from you after a little while. And since there's so many of us here today, the easiest way of doing that is we're going to ask you to virtually raise your hand. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer, or I believe it's on the top of your screen if you're on a cell phone, and you click participants, on the right-hand side, there'll be a little button that's gray or blue that says raise hand. So when you do that, Robert, Anna, we will be able to see you and we'll call on you and unmute you that way. So since we just can't physically see you, that's the way that we would like to organize this, so it's not total chaos. If you have problems with that, you can wave and we'll try to track you down, but for now, virtually raise your hand if you can. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our speakers today. Again, thank you all so much for being here. It's my pleasure to turn this over to the Curator of Historical American Art, Anna O'Marley, and of course to our guest, Dr. Robert Hicks. We're so excited to be doing this partnership program with the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, and welcome to the two of you and welcome to everyone. Cheers.
I'm muted.
Yep.
Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Abby, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks everyone for joining us for another great PAFA Pours. I see there's 66 people so far. I knew that if I invited Robert Hicks to this program, we would get a great turnout. So yes, he's gonna do it. He's gonna get in costume while I give my introduction. So our speaker who is going to be helping me this evening is Dr. Robert Hicks. And it says owner on him, but he's the gentleman there who may remind you of your nightmare in the Middle Ages. And I'm going to give an introduction to Dr. Hicks. And then I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to share a few images with you and talk about why we're doing this program today. So I think he should keep his mask on for this while I introduce you to him. So Dr. Robert Hicks is Senior Consulting Scholar and William Mall Massey Chair for the History of Medicine at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. For over a decade, he served as the director of the Mütter Museum and the Historical Medical Library at the college. Now, not everybody is from Philadelphia, so Robert, when we get started, maybe you could tell them what the Mütter Museum is. We know it's the most popular museum in Philadelphia, but people who are not from Philadelphia might not know that. So Dr. Hicks, like me, even though he knows an awful lot about medicine, is not a medical doctor. He has a doctorate in history from the University of Exeter in the UK and degrees in anthropology and archaeology from the University of Arizona. And his most recent book is Civil War Medicine, A Surgeon's Experience, which was published in 2019 by Indiana University Press. So he is very well published author and scholar. And I wanted to let you know that I got to know Dr. Robert Hicks when we worked on an exhibition together in 2011 called Anatomy Academy that I curated with my colleagues Julian Robson and Robert Cosolino, and we studied the history of the body in medicine and art in the city of Philadelphia, and that's how I became friends with Robert Hicks. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to share a few images and tell you why I wanted to do this session. And then I'm going to sort of turn it over to Robert, and he will take off his mask and guide us through the reason I invited him to talk with us. But I also want to say that we have a lot of great guests with us today, including one of our colleagues, Trevor, from the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, who worked with Robert Hicks on one of the projects that he's going to talk about today, the Spit Spreads Death project. So thank you, Trevor, for coming in from Massachusetts to chat with us today. And I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Great. All right, so PAFA Pores 1918. So I'm going to let Robert take over in a minute, but I just wanted to show you, this is our contact info up here. I'm Anna Marley. I'm the Curator of Historic American Art at PAFA, and Robert Hicks I already introduced to you. And this painting is really what got me thinking about doing this session on 1918. Some of you attended our previous session of one of our PAFA Pores, which was on the yellow fever epidemic in 1793. And Dr. Amy Henderson came and talked to us about city and country life in Philadelphia in the 1790s and the yellow fever epidemic and how horrible it was. 5% of the population of Philadelphia died. And so I had always been touched by this painting of the Wright family in our collection at PAFA, which shows Joseph Wright painting his family. And before he could complete it, both he and his wife died of yellow fever, leaving the children orphaned. And then on the right, I'm showing you a painting called The Pestilence by Hugh Henry Breckenridge, who taught at PAFA for over 40 years. And he was deeply affected by the twin calamities of World War I and the Spanish flu. epidemic. And so that brings me to Dr. Hicks. And the reason I asked him to join us today, because of a recent exhibition that he worked on at the Mütter Museum about the Spanish influenza epidemic in 1918, which provoked this really powerful, fantastic painting that was in our show at PAFA a few years ago, World War I in American Art, but is also in our permanent collection. And I'm showing you here on the screen two infamous depictions of parades associated with World War I and the Spanish influenza epidemic here in Philadelphia. And I think, Robert, I will have you take over speaking now for the next little while to go through the rest of these images.
Sure, okay. And I think in light of what you are showing now, I will suggest when to advance the slide.
Yes.
Good idea. Well, hello everybody, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy social calendar in isolation to be here to talk about the Spanish flu 1918. Now, the photograph on the left-hand side opposite the painting was taken on September 28th, 1918, and shows the largest parade in Philadelphia's history up to that point, the Liberty Loan fundraising parade. World War I is in progress. People are turning out to give their rah-rah patriotism a look and also to buy war bonds. Let's consider Philadelphia in 1918, one of the largest American cities, an industrial powerhouse. The economy has switched to war production. 1,700,000 people live here. Approximately 300,000 additional war workers have come into town, mostly immigrants living in the poorer South Side neighborhoods, but around the shipyards where a lot of the activity is taking place. Now, this is a modern city. It has the largest African-American population of any Northern American city. And remember, the war is in progress. I'm going to focus on events in the fall of 1918. But remember, this is the 20th century. This is within living memory of people who are still with us. Also, they've got airplanes, they've got radio, they've got cars, they've got modern conveniences that we would recognize, of course. But let's take a moment to take a view of what is happening in mid-October of 1918 in Philadelphia. At St. Joseph's Seminary, the college was closed, as were all the other colleges. The closures were not as severe as we are experiencing right now with coronavirus because people still had to get to work, and the pressure to produce for the war effort was intense. But let's take a look at what these seminary students are doing. They've been told classes have been canceled, and they've been summoned together in a classroom, and they are told the city is in the grip of this flu epidemic. They weren't calling it a pandemic at that moment, it's an epidemic. And they're told, you have to go out in the community and do some good. That's what we're going to do. We're going to put you in pairs and give you a horse and a cart. And your job is to walk up and down the residential streets and collect the dead. Now think about that. This is 20th century Philadelphia, and I could be describing a scene out of 14th century Europe. But that's what Philadelphia was doing in mid-October 1918. How do we get to that? The flu had begun to appear, and the fact that it was called the Spanish flu is a product of the lack of press censorship in Spain. A lot of reports coming out of Spain, getting worldwide attention, and so these flu cases were tagged Spanish flu, but there wasn't anything Spanish about it. And as we see today, germs don't recognize political subdivisions, boundaries. All they want is a warm, moist human body. So what happened to Philadelphia? How did we get there? Well, the Navy had been experiencing some cases, in fact, lots of them up in Boston, which was one of the explosion points for the flu, also in some of the training camps. Almost impossible to pinpoint exactly where the flu began to erupt. But the flu was a familiar story. We'd seen the flu before. We'd even seen some epidemics of the flu. But what happened this time was a bit different. At this Liberty Loan Parade, Patriotic banners are everywhere. You see in this photograph, there's the Navy in the foreground, soldiers marching. War widows were stationed on sidewalks to hold informal talks with passersby to regale them with stories of the sacrifices of their own husbands who lost their lives in the war. Now, in the fall of 1918, the US has been in the war for over a year. And obviously in Europe, this has been going on far longer. At this moment, we have 1.5 million soldiers in France. At this moment, about 30% of available doctors in Philadelphia are in France instead of in peacetime at the hospitals. And approximately 50% of all nurses in Philadelphia are in France. So it's not a good time for a disease to swoop through. Well, they begin to show up sporadic cases in the shipyards. The Navy had about 300 some odd sailors come down with the flu up in Boston, and for a reason I know not, the Boston naval authorities sent them down to Philadelphia, where they continued to get sick and infect other people. So cases begin to appear in the shipyards. So physicians are on notice, public health directors on notice that something is happening and we ought to keep an eye on it. Well, the Liberty Loan Parade had 200,000 plus people there. 3 days after that parade, next one, Anna, next slide. The very next day, 3 days later, every hospital bed in the city was filled. That takes us to the first week of October. The first week of October, we have hundreds of flu deaths. Second week, about 2,600. Third week, about 4,500. So you see the death rate begins to skyrocket. On this lamppost, there had been a banner placed for the patriotic event of the parade. Before anyone had a chance to take those banners down, public health notices began going up. So you see the Spreads Death sign superimposed over a parade sign. Spit Spreads Death appears on the trolleys as well. Public health signs begin to go up. By this time, an epidemic is clearly in progress. The public health director declares we are in an epidemic. It's now a reportable disease, meaning physicians have to report the cases. And by the time this is all over, 1 out of every 4 Philadelphians gets the flu. But over a 6-week period, about 12,000 people die, about 1 every 5 minutes. And it continues in bumps for the next few months into the early spring of 1919. So this overwhelms the entire city infrastructure in a big hurry. Now, people are prohibited from gathering in big groups. Concerts are canceled. School is closed. People are still going to their places of work. There's nobody to pay your salary if you're not there. We don't have a world of unemployment benefits yet. And we don't have the reserves of emergency agencies, whether state, local, or federal. None of that is available. So the city really becomes paralyzed very, very quickly. Now, people can telephone one another, but telephones in those days are switchboard operated. Switchboard operators are now getting sick. Taxi drivers are sick. The police force really does experience a blue flu, and hundreds of police officers cannot come to work. This presents an immediate problem for the burial of the dead. Let's go to the next one, Anna. As you see here, nurses are mobilized where they are available. And if you saw a nurse, and remember, nurses and doctors still make house calls in those days. So a woman in this uniform would be a familiar sight. And the wearing of gauze masks was now very common. Some cities were mandating the wearing of them by law. It would be a criminal offense not to. Philadelphia didn't do that. But just as now, these masks are becoming a familiar sight. But almost instantly, the American Red Cross, the Surgeon General, are putting up all kinds of health advisory notices, usually in the form of catchy little rhymes that people can remember. But I call your attention to the poster in the back. Now, while this flu is taking off exponentially, remember, we have a war to fight, and the effort to raise money for the war bonds is getting paramount attention. So a poster behind says, "If I fail, he dies," shows a nurse with a wounded soldier. So the public advisories are really stark and challenging. If I fail my job, someone is going to die as a result. The wearing of masks, the Red Cross circulated a little ditty, which I can't shake out of my head, to encourage people to wear them. Obey the laws and wear the gauze. Protect your paws from septic, protect your jaws from septic paws, excuse me. Almost remember that. Next, please. It's important to remember this is all happening in the shade of patriotic ardor, because at no other time in American history has freedom of expression been restricted as it was in 1918 and throughout our participation in the war. Any criticism of a government program could be construed as unpatriotic slander, and one could be brought into court. There was even a man who criticized the federal budget out loud and was criminally cited for that. So that was the environment. Now, here we have a familiar image of the nurse. If you can see, she has a dark collar and there's a little button showing itself in just above her white smock. And that is a fundraising button known as a honor button. She gave money for the war effort and was therefore allowed to wear an honor button. You could challenge people on the street who were not wearing honor buttons and call them slackers, which was the worst term of opprobrium at the time, aside from hoarders, like people who buy up all the toilet paper. I don't recall that specific problem being raised in 1918. So you see the kinds of advice on this poster that people were encouraged to do. Now, interestingly enough, the wash your hands frequently bit is not part of this. And it's a reminder that in 1918, although the flu was recognized, its symptoms were recognized, and it was a household word, the virus that caused the flu was not yet identified. And therefore, there was no vaccine. Although there was an attempt to create vaccines during this panic, none of them worked. Nevertheless, the mortality skyrockets. And people, of course, have to blame somebody. And so it's usually turning to immigrants. And as we have seen all too common recently, Asian Americans or Asians just living in this country have been targeted as wicked Chinese who originated the pandemic. Well, the 1918 version of that was the Germans. Everybody hated the Germans. German music was not performed in concerts. Dachshunds were even killed. People would not eat German food, play German music. And lynch mobs were taking place with the killing of suspected German spies. Even Bayer aspirin, German-owned company, had the patent on it. This was in common circulation, but people suspected, wait a minute, the Germans could plant influenza in aspirin and poison us all. So a federal agency had to investigate and assure the public that there's nothing in that aspirin that you can't take. Next, please. This is one of the death certificates issued during the time, and I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment, because we've made heavy use of them at the Mütter Museum for the exhibit. And I'll say something more about the Mütter Museum too in a moment, as you asked me to, Anna. People were dying in such large numbers that it completely overwhelms a system to handle them. And people are, in fact, burying their own dead, or the example I gave you, the seminary students, there's an oral history that survives of one of those seminary students from many years later, who said that he and his partner took turns going in to drag out the dead bodies from homes as they were calling out for the dead in their cart. Different image of this comes from a survivor, a family that whose experience we have made use of in our exhibition. They had a sister in their Irish immigrant family, a young sister, 3 years old, Elizabeth Conway, who caught the flu and died. Parents also caught the flu, but they had to continue working and they survived it. But this is a good capsule example of what happened throughout Philadelphia. This little girl dies, and the father is forced to take the child outside and bury her in the backyard. But when the flu eventually hits and people start regaining some normalcy, what happens? Some of those dead remain where they are. Some of them are collected and taken to other cemeteries. But then you're stuck with the pain of this. And as we have found with our exhibit, it is eliciting so much interest in Philadelphia. We're receiving all kinds of stories, family stories, including that one, that are told by people who did not directly experience anything in 1918, but the family trauma attached to the story continues to be felt in the families today. And Elizabeth Conway's case, she's partly remembered for a family photograph taken shortly after in the 1920s showing the children of that family, but the conspicuous absence of Elizabeth is still what haunts the family today. And for years afterwards, no one really talked about this in that family, but the father, Patrick Conway, would occasionally absent himself, go down to the basement where he had stashed away Elizabeth's dolls, particularly the little doll tea parties she liked to set out. And he would take those out and set them up and just sit with them for a while, and then eventually put them back and return to family business. So that's a suffering that went unnoticed by other people and endured to the rest of his life. And think of that multiplied by all those other families of ultimately about 18,000 people who died during this time. These death certificates, which the city has put all online, are capsule histories themselves of these families. And here you have one of a young white mother not working outside the home, a Russian immigrant from a Jewish family who dies in her early 30s. The official cause of death is pneumonia, but influenza is also recorded as the triggering cause of this. So pneumonia, influenza, and pneumonia are commonly recorded on these death certificates. Next. Now, you did the program on the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793, and here you have an eerie mention of that in this photograph, or at least a recollection of that. This is a photograph that was in the newspaper that shows people digging mass graves. Some of them are probably seminary students because that was another thing they did. And one of the best archives of primary source information on the Philadelphia epidemic in 1918 is the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia. Who knew? But they happen to have a lot of photographs, correspondence, and other records that attest to the suffering. So there were mass graves dug because the bodies simply piled up so quickly. City morgue could only take about 36 people. And so with those hundreds and then thousands of people dying in short order, multiple morgues had to be opened up. And remember, these places are not refrigerated and it's still warm weather. You don't have refrigeration trucks as we are seeing now in the news. Next, please. Now, before I get to our own exhibit, of which these are some images, we'd like to point out that the flu hit very hard, begins to subside, and disappears. In November, at least in November, people are going back to work, things are opening up again. Even though it continues on for a few months, the mortality levels are higher than they would otherwise be. Philadelphia, Scranton, and Harrisburg, 3 cities in Pennsylvania, had the highest mortality rates of any American cities. We do not know why that is. We, in fact, do not know why the flu strain that killed so many people in 1918 globally, a true pandemic, why that happened with a flu variant that continues to be with us. H1N1 is the flu variant that killed in 1918. And we've had a 1957, a 1968, and a 2009 pandemic of the flu, not as devastating as 1918. And if you got a flu shot this past season, the strain you were inoculated against was our friend H1N1. And the point here is the killer of 1918 hasn't gone away. It's still out there. And it's one of the other variants of the flu that continues to percolate through the population. Now, with the daily news cycle of coronavirus, which is incessant, and the body count that we keep hearing about, you might recall, or maybe you don't recall, because you may not know, that the 2017-2018 flu season killed 79,000 people in this country. Usually it's between about 3,000 and 12,000 a year, but that year killed as many people, or maybe more, than in 2009 when we had a verified pandemic called swine flu. So that doesn't get all the attention because flu is simply endemic. We just know it, laugh at it, figure we got to endure it. Could it come again in the 1918 fashion? Sure. I'm not an MD. Thank you for Anna for pointing out I'm not an MD, although they went on TV, I think, somewhat convincingly. Which brings us to our exhibit. And I'd like to shout out Trev for participating tonight, who was a key player in this. The exhibit that you cannot visit at the moment, but when the plague clears, we want you to come. Now, we wanted to do an exhibit on this event in Philadelphia, which is a very curious event because we found that a lot of people know that it happened, but they don't know much about it, and they don't really know what happened in Philadelphia. And one of the challenges is, unlike, say, the American Civil War, which gives us battlefields and monuments all over the place, flu gave us nothing but graves. There are many cemeteries in the Philadelphia area that have flu graves that are conspicuously dated as such. But other than that, there's no monument. There was never a commemorative moment to recognize what people went through at that time. So about 5 years ago, we decided to create a long-term exhibition on the flu, explore Philadelphia's story, do some things that we don't normally do, such as use all those death certificates in the form of a database and have interactives in the museum that allow you, as this lower photograph shows, this is one of the interactives, how the flu progressed maybe in your neighborhood, maybe even in your own home. Did somebody die of the flu in 1918 where you live, perhaps? We've had a couple people come forth and say they did in fact do that search and were thunderstruck to find out that somebody died in the flu in their very home. Not unusual. If, for example, you were a school teacher and want to find out, did school teachers die? You can interrogate the interactive and find that answer. In doing this, we also wanted to bring in artists, and not to have artists simply take a snapshot of the flu and create some illustration that somehow speaks to it that we can put in a corner. But we asked our artists to come in and create an exhibit, to create a work of art of whatever medium seems appropriate, taking inspiration from the events of the flu, something that would become an integral part of our exhibit. And that's where Trevor Smith came in. We were hugely excited to make his acquaintance and begin working with him on an earlier grant and then some subsequent grants which brought this into being. And he was the liaison to the arts component. We had another curator who helped us with the history, but Trevor linked us to a number of artists, and we ended up selecting Blast Theory. And so we worked with a consortium based in the UK. And their inspiration was to create effectively a piece of performance art and film it. And they wanted to recreate the Liberty Loan Parade of 1918. Now, when I first heard that, my bowels turned to water as I thought of the logistics of bringing in 200,000 people. No, we didn't have to do that. We had a restricted parade following much of the original route. And this was all organized and carried out by Blast Theory. And they came up with a film of the event. And this event was quite a powerful thing. We had about 500 people marching on the 101st anniversary of the Liberty Loan Parade in Philadelphia. And people came with signs like this, representing specific people. The reverse side is a death certificate for that person. All the people who were represented in the parade in this fashion, and everybody carried a placard, died on the same day, October 12th, the day of highest mortality. Many of the people who came, and they had to register ahead of time, could choose an ancestor to represent. Some people came with their homemade signs. But one of the really startling and gripping parts of this experience was not only to participate in this, but the way the parade was managed was a work of art in its own right. It wasn't simply people walking along a route and then ending someplace. There was a design to it, funneled through light barriers and allowed a private moment to highlight the person they're representing. But there was also music composed by a choral group called The Crossing. And it was like a Gregorian chant, but the words consisted of names of the dead and also the health instructions given by public health authorities. And people were playing this on their mobile phones. They all dialed into the same thing. So people were surrounded by ambient sound. It was a very powerful experience. When you get a chance to see this exhibition, you will see a film of this parade. And just watching the film is stunning. It's about a 13-minute film. So I'd like to also express my thanks to all the work Trevor did to help get us there. So our parade and the entire exhibition has become an interesting public event, particularly in light of coronavirus. Everyone now is interested in comparisons with 1918, with what's happening now. And one of the reasons we decided to do this in the first place was we anticipated that at any given moment during the exhibit run, people would walk into this exhibit with something in the news percolating in their heads about maybe an Ebola outbreak or some other disease. And in 2016, a World Congress of epidemiologists predicted that over the next century, the planet would experience approximately 4 pandemics, one of which is likely to be the flu. Well, that was only 4 years ago, and so it's 1 down, 3 to go, I suppose. So here we are. But people were coming forth, like the Conway family, giving us stories of family misery. And they're thanking us for an opportunity to share a family story that was never shared outside of families. And people want to express that trauma. We've decided to collect those stories. We've got about 70 so far. And later this year, we will debut a digital scrapbook so that people can read these stories of Philadelphians. The stories range from the comic, believe it or not, to the absolutely grotesque. And I do mean comics. Some of the stories are recollections by adults who were children at the time and had a very child's eye view of what was going on. So that's a very brisk story of a disease pandemic. And in a way, it's very unsatisfactory because you don't have heroes standing tall with an American flag on the battlefield. It's just disease. People get sick, a lot of people die, people have to cope, and then it goes away. But the two things I need to mention, one is there is a highlight to the story in a way. Just as we're finding out now with people finding alternate ways to do business, alternate ways to communicate with people, they're reestablishing links to people maybe through telephone rather than personal visits. Even the social landscape has changed significantly in the last month or so. Well, people responded similarly in 1918. And the biggest example of that was volunteerism. People were still reeling from the rapidly escalating deaths, began to self-organize and even organize the available doctors and nurses into districts and work with the public health director to find money to essentially run an emergency operations center in a department store of all places. People volunteered their own cars as emergency vehicles and would sport green flags on them to indicate that they had the right of way. All this was fairly self-organized in cahoots with the public health director for Philadelphia. It took a few weeks, but it's interesting to see people were going to find a way to be resilient. They're going to find a way to navigate it, find a way to get out of it. Now, the one thing, Anna, I did not comment on is the Mütter Museum. I should highlight that the Mütter Museum needs no introduction. It is renowned throughout the galaxy as the best medical museum in the United States. It is a museum of pathological anatomy. So it has babies in jars. It has skeletons, but it very much reflects past medical practice. We have the trademark moniker Birthplace of American Medicine because the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, which is the organization that owns the museum, was founded the same year the United States Constitution was drafted. And some of the founders of the American Republic, and Dr. Benjamin Rush, were involved with the college. We're fellows or members of the college. We still have a vibrant membership. We have the museum, we have a historical medical library. So our collection spans the history of healthcare in this country and the history of how medical ideology and practice has changed over time. So we put those resources to work to create this exhibit. You'll have to come visit us as soon as you can. Over to you, Anna.
Wow. Thank you so much, Robert. That was amazing. And I'm glad we have about 20 minutes to chat. I know we gave Trevor some shout outs. So Trevor, are you still on the call with us?
I am, yeah.
Hi, Trevor. Can you introduce yourself and say hi to everybody?
Hi, my name's Trevor. I'm the curator of the present tense at the Peabody Essex Museum here in Salem, Massachusetts, and it was my very great honor and privilege to work with Robert, to be invited by Robert to work on this project with him. You know, the last few weeks, as we have been going through our own pandemic experience, I've been kind of reminded that one of our kind of starting points in thinking about who we wanted to work with and what our kind of goals were for the project was to somehow kind of personalize what at that point felt like, you know, kind of incomprehensible statistics and numbers, and somehow bring this story in alive to people in a very personal and direct way, which I do think the parade did, and I think that the exhibition as a whole, particularly for Philadelphia residents, as Robert was articulating so well, it definitely did that. Of course, we're sitting here in a very changed world. We all now have a very personal relationship to what it means to live in a pandemic. Something that was abstract and historical and perhaps a little bit distance is now, we're right in the thick of it. So every day I kind of get up and I think about that a little bit.
And Trevor wrote a really nice blog post recently about that, kind of thinking back to the parade and thinking about 1918. And I think that blog post is available on the Peabody Essex Museum website.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat window for those who want to read it after.
Great, thanks, Trevor. I see some questions already in the chat, and here's kind of a. I'm gonna take this as a funny question. So, that mask you were wearing, was that effective at all?
I don't think you saw them in 1918. And one footnote shout out, I see that we have Evie Newman on, and I think she's in Ireland, are you not, Evie? Yes, so we have an Irish-based participant who's a former
yes, I am.
Manager of exhibits
Hi,
for the Mütter
Evie.
Museum. And so, Evie, you can virtually kiss my beak if you like. I'll accept that. The question about these masks being effective. Interestingly, here we're being encouraged with coronavirus to wear masks, and viruses are tiny and they can travel through masks, but a mask can retard some stuff. For example, whatever's in your sputum could be contained with a mask, or somebody else's sputum could arrive on your mask and not get in your lungs. And that's, of course, the whole protective idea. Today, if I walked into a Walgreens with this on, it probably would serve the same purpose. I've just got the eye holes open, but the original mask would have had glass or mica over here. And the reason for the long beak is it would conceal possibly a vinegar-shaped sponge or other aromatic spices, because, of course, people for a long time associated disease with miasmas, miasmatic vapors, and bad scents. So if you clean up the air, it militates against disease. So this might be a little helpful for coronavirus. Would have done nothing for bubonic plague, or flu could get in there right through the eyes if I had worn this. So there are a few examples of this that survive from the 17th century, and it shows up in a lot of illustrations. The degree to which they were actually worn is still kind of questionable, because we've got a lot of imagery, but we don't have a lot of physical examples in collections.
Thanks, Robert. There was a question from Liza Kerwin. Hi, Liza, about Breckenridge. And you were also asking, were there other artists who responded to the 1918 flu? And I think we have my colleague, Laurel, on the phone, who worked on our World War I exhibition. And I wonder if she is here and wants to weigh in on that, because I did not work on that exhibition. And I know the Breckenridge painting, and of course I know the Paulette Van Roken's painting, which is also, that's reaction to World War I, not so much the flu. But I don't know if Laurel knows the answer to that.
I don't actually. There were a few photographs by. No, I don't. Now that I think about it, really the pestilence was the one that addressed that directly. There there were a few other medical photographs of the time, but they really had to do with the war itself. They were by Anna Coleman Ladd, but nothing. Yeah, that was the only thing in the show, I believe. Yeah.
Robert, do you know of any artists who did work related to the Spanish influenza?
There were, I recall seeing in the UK, some British combat artists and some of the surgeons, the artists who worked with surgeons, recorded, I think, some cases. But I don't recall seeing any of them say among American troops. They must certainly exist, images of people suffering the flu, but I cannot think of any artists, particularly at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Liza,
literature, yes.
Topic for future research, I think.
Well, the one artist that comes to mind is a novelist rather than somebody who's working with the visual arts, and I hardly recommend this. Catherine Ann Porter, who was a young journalist in Denver at the time of the flu, got the flu, and her lover was an Army lieutenant. He got it too. She went into the real deep, abysmal pit of flu symptoms, and everybody regarded her as a terminal case, where her sensory organs simply weren't functioning properly. You hallucinate. The world simply turns inside out and upside down, and then you die. But she didn't, and she came out of it, and she wrote a novella called Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which you can still find. She discovered that her lover had died of the flu, didn't make it. And in her case, woman in her early 20s, her hair turned white as a result of her experience. But the novella is a nice snapshot of the times, what the cultural currents were all about, and particularly gripping description of the experience of getting the flu and thinking you're going to die.
Yeah. Abby, I see we have 2 raised hands.
Yeah, I saw Richard's hand first, if that's all right. Richard, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead. Hi, Richard. Do you still have a question? If not, I think we might move on to Lily. And Richard, if you want to come back. I'm just aware we only have a few minutes. So Lily, if you're ready, I see you on my screen. Here.
Yes, I'm just chiming. Oh, sorry. Do I unmute? Sorry.
Go for it. You're unmuted.
Oh, good. Fantastic. I'm just responding with the power of Google here on my other computer. So to answer that question about artists, apparently, and I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong. I've only seen it written and never heard it pronounced. Egon Schiele, Schiele, was working on a portrait of his family, much like the one that you showed earlier, which was again never finished because he and his family, or he and his wife at least, both died of the flu. And the portrait of his family has this sort of like him staring out at the audience. And Edvard Munch, I think, Gustav Klimt did a deathbed portrait of Schiele. But I think there's also something from Munch. So it sounds like sort of this, like that part of the world, the artists were responding, quite a lot to it.
Thanks, Lily.
None of it's me. I'd love to take credit for it. I really would.
And also that reminds me also of artists who died. Emily Clayton Bishop, who was a really talented sculptor who studied at PAFA with William Merritt Chase and received a large amount of prizes. She died because of the Spanish flu. I also think Annie Traquair-Lang, another woman student of William Merritt Chase, died of the Spanish influenza. So it had a pretty dramatic effect on artists in the Philadelphia community. I know about those 2 because I've been studying women artists of that period. So if I know about those 2, I'm sure there's more.
Yeah. Anna, we have 2 more questions that just popped up in the chat. The first one is, which lessons from the 1918 pandemic do you think we still have to learn? For you and for Robert.
Well, one lesson I think we need to learn, and I don't mean this necessarily just as individual citizens, but just the whole universe. We've got to get straight on what is authoritative information, how is that information be delivered, and how should it be updated, and how should people monitor it. We see with today particularly how things have just skyrocketed in all kinds of media directions, and you can get every conspiracy theory mixed in with quasi-facts. And there's no way to avoid my saying this. It doesn't help when you've got people in Washington getting in front of news cameras who are in positions of responsibility and don't know what they're talking about. And they're acting surprised, like, pandemic? Never heard that word before. People have been on notice for quite some time about this. This has been predicted again and again in recent years. So one is we've got to get alignment with the people who make decisions, and it's not easy. In 1918, it wasn't easy either. Part of the controversy there is, should that Liberty Loan parade have taken place? Today, we might consider that as a possible vector for the transmission of the disease, and since all you had to do was inhale and exhale in front of somebody to transmit the flu, that parade probably wasn't a good thing to do. But the political reality at the time was there was no way that could have been avoided. The patriotic fervor was so high pressure, and all the major cities were doing this. The day before Philadelphia had its parade, Chicago had its parade, just like ours, except the President of the United States was there. But since we're talking about presidents, President Wilson never once made a public comment about the flu, which killed about 675,000 people in the United States in 1918. The reason he did not was he did not want to do anything that took attention away from the drive to end the war. And you may recall that the armistice was actually achieved in early November. But even in October, that was not at all certain. And so everything was subordinate to the war effort. Here today, we don't have that kind of war pressure going on. There are other pressures in the world, of course. But it's difficult to manage these events, manage a pandemic when you've got a war going on and it has to take priority. Today, I suppose the equivalent is get the economy going.
Yeah.
Maybe we have to sacrifice a few lives, but it gets people back to business, and the market should be the determinant of things, not whether people are sick at home. And by the way, it's an opportunity to get rid of some baby boomers. Who are they? Know any? But I'm diverting a little bit. The other lesson is people are self-reliant and resilient, and it took some time. It took a few weeks, but that resilience was harnessed in an organized way. People today are doing things on a very local and individual basis, and it's too bad that can't be made more collective. Like the bus drivers driving school buses to deliver lunches and breakfasts to poor kids, for example. Doesn't happen everywhere. We don't even have unanimity among our governors. We have governors forming regional consortia, informal consortia, but some governors aren't playing at all. And when the Florida governor allows spring break to take place because, well, it's, don't want to disappoint all those highly sex-charged college students. Well, what should take precedence here? Today, we have surveillance systems that were not in place then. We have disease surveillance systems. We have the World Health Organization, which is doing a very good job at the moment. The Centers for Disease Control, and we at the Mütter know people there who are on the front lines of this. So we get reports. These people are doing truly heroic things and need financial support and need strong political support. I don't know how we achieve that except for us to question and demand that candidates for public office pay close attention to this. When this one passes and we have a vaccine and people are relieved, there's going to be another one. And coronavirus could come back like the flu in a slightly different variant that just knocks people over all over again. Population of the planet has more than doubled in my lifetime, which isn't all that long, but that we're not prepared for that. And we expect our infrastructure to support anything like that. We see people agitating in the streets for a return to open businesses, but they're doing so for really fairly irritating reasons. I mean, reasons that don't amount to serious crises, but mostly irritations. Can't get your hair done. Or I need to plant flowers in my flower bed before the season passes. We have to learn to live with some sacrifices and learn to live with some forces constraining our movements that we're just not accustomed to doing as Americans. And if you look at America with respect to other countries that are dealing with this much more successfully at the moment. You see the advantage of early warning, close alliance between scientific and political authorities, and a willingness of people to simply buckle under, do what has to be done to make it go away.
Robert, let me ask you a follow-up
Yes.
question that is a little more intellectual, but as a historian, you know, Amy and I were talking about the yellow fever epidemic a few weeks ago. We're talking about the 1918 pandemic. What is it that makes people ignore history? I mean, I know everybody thinks history's boring, but people go to the Mütter Museum. People love it. So and it's not just the babies in jars. Like, how do we get people to understand that history has lessons to teach us?
Well, it starts with curiosity, and the Mütter experience is over 180,000 people coming through every year now, and it's been growing steadily every year. We actually do not know exactly why that is, but they do, and that's good. But they truly can see things that they can't see anywhere else. It's a way to discover your own bodies and the range, the spectrum of human physical experience. We don't regard, say, a cancer patient as some freak of nature. It's a thing we accept as something that happens to a human body. That's what people discover there. And I think it starts with the curiosity. The value of the historic perspective is, I think it can reduce panic. And there are lessons in looking at how people coped, the measures they took, what worked and continues to work. And one good example of that, the volunteerism, and mindful of your yellow fever mention, I will mention that you saw that image of the mass grave being dug, and the volunteers who came out to do all that digging. Well, there's an interesting parallel between the 1793 yellow fever and the 1918 flu. In 1918, the mayor of Philadelphia ended up posting an ad that the city offices, the city functions are so depleted of people. If there are able-bodied people willing to come and have a set of hands, able to work, could you please show up and you'll be assigned a job for the day? That was exactly the same thing that the mayor of Philadelphia did in 1793 during the yellow fever epidemic, which killed about 10% of Philadelphia. And remember, at that time, Philadelphia was the capital of the United States. Congress fled town and didn't meet because they didn't even know if they had a legal authority to do so. Such was the young United States, and so little history of precedent on how to do things. So 1793, the mayor's doing the same thing as the mayor did in 1918. I could conceive of that happening today. Volunteers being asked, just show up, we've got a problem, we'll assign you a job, do what you can, and help keep the city safe and keep it functioning.
Well, Abby, we've got 2 more minutes.
Exactly. We had one more question in the chat I wanted to which ties into talking about yellow fever and the conversation we had before and also now. This is from Joanna asking, COVID-19 is affecting the African American community at a significant rate in proportion to the population. What do we know of the Spanish flu's impact on the African American population in 1918? That's
a very good question. And it's interesting that some of the primary sources on the African American side, like the newspapers, were reluctant to talk about it. And particularly with the war going on, look at the dilemma. You've got African American troops still fighting as segregated units, still fighting as they were doing in the Civil War, Spanish American War, now World War I, having to prove their manhood, that they are in fact capable of fighting a war and exercising the kind of courage that you expect a soldier to have. So that argument is still being run. So here you have the challenge of continuing to show manhood, to show patriotic interest, to show that you are every inch a citizen of equal value to any other citizen in this country. Do you want to then step forward and say, yeah, but by the way, we've got this problem here. African Americans are being stricken with the flu. It sounds unpatriotic, and it sounds like it militates against the image of manhood that you're trying to project. So there's a real dilemma for people in the African American community. What we know is, at the very least, the least of our knowledge, African Americans were suffering as other people were. And those in the particularly hard-hit communities tended to be crowded, poor sanitation, the working class neighborhoods. This was an era with machine hall politics, patronage. There were very few resources for education, for health maintenance, clinics in some of the neighborhoods, the working neighborhoods, the immigrant neighborhoods, which means the African-American neighborhoods particularly. So we know that they suffered as well as everybody else. I don't know that anyone's prepared to say they suffered in greater numbers. There's a little bit of evidence to show in Philadelphia their mortality seemed to be a bit less than that among the white population. I don't know if that can be supported with further study. And of course, today we have the news that there could be some interesting genetic reason why African Americans, at least some, might be more susceptible to coronavirus. And it's really hard to make judgments about that since we still know so little about who has the disease and who doesn't today because of the relative lack of testing. It's a good question. And I should point out, no one has written the book or a book at all on the Philadelphia experience of the 1918 flu. There are a lot of primary source records in archives throughout this community that can be tapped with primary source information that really gives some interesting glimpses. We hit some of those to prepare this exhibit and realize there's not only a lot of stuff out there, but even our preliminary gathering of data tells us that the official death count for Philadelphia flu in 1918 was probably an undercount. So somebody could still take a scholarly view or even a popular writing view and write the Philadelphia story and really peer into this particular question more deeply. To date, hardly anybody has done this. This has not been a hot topic of scholarly investigation.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great way to end this. A little bit of like a call to all of you, if anyone wants to write that story. And I want to take this moment to thank you, Dr. Robert Hicks, and Anna for being here, and everyone for joining us tonight for this event. We hope to see you at future PAFA Pours and last mask appearance for the evening.
That's right.
But yeah, but cheers to all of you. Be safe, and thank you for being here tonight with us.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriel. Hi, Gabriel.
Thank you.
Cheers.
David Gabe has made it.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Ooh.